before we start the conversation with Carol, Chris, I have a question for all of you. May I have your attention, please? Just as I thought. Carol, thanks so much for joining us this morning, for taking time out from what I know has been a really busy and hectic schedule. So let's just start, before we go into the details of what's been decided. You've been in higher education for your entire professional life. On a human level and a professional level, on every conceivable level, what have these last few months been like for you?
This is, without doubt, the most difficult set of issues I've ever dealt with in my entire career. There are so many unknowns, so many things that we can't predict. And we have to be constantly flexible to accommodate to changing conditions. And everything is interrelated. So it is an enormous, enormous planning challenge.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but there's been a lot of stuff written about the future of higher education and even about the future of specific campuses. What's your own read about how UC Berkeley sits right now in specific and on a broader level, what this all means for higher ed?
I don't think higher education will ever be the same after this crisis. This is a crisis universally for higher education, as well as a crisis for individual colleges and universities as they confront both the actual effects of the pandemic on their operation, but also the many financial challenges that the pandemic has created for colleges and universities. On the other hand, there is a kind of silver lining in this cloud. It's just some of our faculty have said, as we made the change to teaching remotely, it's like I discovered a muscle I never knew I had before. And I don't think faculty are going to forget they have that muscle. We're anticipating we're going to have a much, much larger remote presence, not just in California, but in the country and the world as a result of this crisis. Many of our employees have begun working remotely, and one of the most frequent comments we get on the employee surveys that we do are, can I keep working remotely after the crisis is over? So I think work will change. I think instruction will change. There are some schools that won't make it, but I think other schools are going to emerge more strongly from the crisis.
How do you like our chances?
I think they're great.
So speaking of which, let's go back to last March, a few months back. Berkeley was one of the first campuses to sort of hit the pause button and go entirely remote. What led to that? Where were you getting information from? What guided that decision, and what sort of gave the campus, if you will, the courage to step out in front of so many others?
What motivated that decision on my part was a talk that I heard by one of our faculty members, Nicholas Jewell. He's a biostatistician, a faculty member in the School of Public Health. And that talk made it so clear to me that every day's delay was going to result in more deaths. That the growth in the pandemic was exponential, and that it was really important for us to move to remote instruction and work right away. So that talk was on a Saturday. I called my cabinet together on the Sunday, and we decided we were going to announce on Monday that we would go remote the next day. And so that was how we made the decision.
And before we go on, I just want to remind those of you who may have just joined us that we're here with UC Berkeley's Chancellor, Carol Christ, talking about this unprecedented time, and that everyone is invited to submit questions as we go along through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So, Carol, I know that over the recent months, you have convened a number of different committees and working groups to talk about recovery and response, and having to do everything with operations and student life, research, housing, instruction. But before we get into the details about what's been decided, talk to us a little bit about the principles, about the values that have been guiding your decisions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. We've been guided in all our decisions by 4 principles. The first is to protect the health of the community. The second is to sustain the continuity of research and instruction. The third is to save as many jobs as possible. And the fourth is to apply an equity lens in all of our decision making.
So let's break this down a little bit. Let's go into some of the, the areas that I mentioned. In terms of instruction, what's it going to, things stand right now, and we know things are changing, unfortunately not in a good way lately, but as things stand right now, how will the instructional world look on the UC Berkeley campus come fall?
All classes that have more than 25 students in them will be remote. Some classes that have 25 or fewer students will be in person. What we are prioritizing are advanced laboratory courses that are very hard to change to a remote mode of instruction. Performing arts classes, similarly very hard to transition to a remote mode of instruction. We will have no more than 1,000 in-person courses and probably considerably fewer than that. Most of our instruction will be remote.
Got it. Just one note, I'm noticing people are sending me questions personally, unilaterally, and so only I can see them, and we're actually capturing them in sort of a convoluted way, if you'll excuse us. So if you do have a question, please post it to everyone, so those that are helping me gather questions can see them and not just me, because I'm trying to pay attention to what the Chancellor is saying. So we've heard there was some, in the spring, it was sort of a quick decision and a quick transition to remote learning. There was dissatisfaction and I think some concerns among students and faculty. What have we learned? What are we doing differently? And what can you say to people who are wondering what kind of experience will there actually be come the fall?
Yeah, those are all really important questions that we spend all our time thinking about. We transitioned to remote learning in the spring with 2 days of notice. So it was, for some of our faculty, I'm sure, like being thrown into the deep end of a swimming pool without any swimming lessons. But now that we have the summer to prepare for the fall, we're investing a lot of resources in trying to make remote instruction as good as it possibly can be. We've created a set of classes, about 30 classes, very frequently taken classes, required classes, classes that are gateway classes, called Semester in the Cloud. We're investing a lot of money and instructional designers into designing that set of 30 classes. About a third of our faculty are taking a set of workshops on best practices in remote instruction. And then we've given over 200 of our graduate students, I think it's about 300 actually, we've given a stipend to the graduate students, their graduate student faculty teams, developing the remote version of the courses that they are planning to offer in the fall. And that summer for those graduate student faculty teams begin with a set of workshops so that they can all learn the best practices in remote instruction. Then they do their design work, and then the summer is going to end with a virtual poster session so that the students and faculty can share what they've discovered, what they've learned with each other.
And how have UC Berkeley faculty responded to all this? It's such a dramatic change for what they've been used to for the most part. There have been some online courses, but what's the feedback you're getting? What are you hearing from our faculty?
I've just been so impressed, overwhelmed, inspired by our faculty's commitment to, in these dramatically changed circumstances for instruction, trying to make things as good as they can possibly be for our students. So faculty that would have talked scornfully about online instruction, say a year ago, are now really throwing themselves into it and discovering things, discovering ways in which it can improve some of the experiences of classes, particularly very large classes. I think there is a huge range of experience of our faculty going into this crisis with remote instruction. Some areas like computer science, for example, that has lots of very large classes, had already been using lots of the tools of remote instruction. Others, I take my own department, English, no experience at all. But I've been just, so inspired by, first of all, how hard the faculty are working, and secondly, how they're in a very trying set of circumstances. I have heard almost no, complaints or grouchiness, but really rather, we're all going to work together in this crisis for the world, for the country, for our institution.
We're going to talk more about instruction later as we take questions that are coming in from folks who are watching the event. But let's turn to housing for a second. How many students are we going to be bringing back to campus to live in university residential halls, and how did we decide on that number?
Currently, we will be welcoming back a little bit over 6,000 students, but that's something that we're continually reassessing as we're looking at the experience of other campuses and also of the public health situation. We will have no triples. We will have a mix of singles and doubles, and we're saving all of Foothill, the Foothill housing complex that has about a little few over 800 beds, as a place to quarantine both students who become ill and also students who are exposed to the virus.
Somebody has already asked, I see a question that's come in, do we already have positive cases on campus of students who've returned or before we ended the spring semester?
We had very few cases by the end of the spring semester, only 11 that we knew of on the campus, and not all of those were on campus. 5 were students in an education abroad program in Madrid. They never came back to the campus, they just went home. But currently, we've recently identified 6 students who had returned to campus who were positive. So I think as we're first of all really ramping up our testing, but also as the virus spreads more, we expect that we will have more positive cases.
And so I'm seeing questions here. Many Lair campers are parents of UC Berkeley students or other students in the Cal system and other institutions of higher education. And there's a lot of interest in what precautions we're taking. What are the sort of on a broad level, what are the steps the campus is taking to meet and to uphold that principle you laid out at the beginning of the safety and well-being of the campus community?
Well, we start with move-in. Move-in is going to be very different than it's ever been. We're not going to have 1 day or 2 days in which everybody is going to move to campus. Rather, we're going to be staggering students' move-in dates. We'll be housing students in cohorts, so students that are involved in the same activity or taking the same curriculum will be housed together on a floor or a wing, and we'll eat together. So in other words, what we're trying to do is the exact opposite of what we usually try to do, which is ensure students get to meet as many other students as possible. We're trying to limit the number of students that an individual student would interact with in a frequent way. We will test all students upon arrival. We will ask them to sequester themselves for 7 to 10 days, and then we will test them again at the end of that period. And we will have not only symptomatic testing, of course, but we're going to have asymptomatic testing in the course of the semester for all students. We haven't quite decided on the frequency of that. It'll be at least every 2 weeks, but it may be more than that as well. All students will be required to wear masks if they're outdoors anywhere on campus, actually outdoors anywhere in the city of Berkeley, because Berkeley has a mask ordinance. Whenever they're in a room with another person, they'll be required to wear a mask to observe social distancing at the door of every building. that we're opening, there will be someone stationed there that will give a mask out to anybody that tries to enter it without a mask, and make sure that people are observing social distancing. We have a symptom checker. I fill it out every day before I come to campus that, checks your symptoms. It's a self-assessment of your symptoms. We are training contact tracers to trace the contacts of anyone who becomes infected and notifies them. So we're putting in place all the public health measures that we think are important to protecting the health of the community to the extent we can.
So given those extensive measures, I'm curious, Berkeley has a leading school of public health. To what extent are you tapping into the knowledge, wisdom, and expertise of our own epidemiologists? Are they a constant source of information? How's that working? How are you connecting with them?
Yes, they're a constant source of information. I have 9 planning committees that are planning various aspects of our fall. And one of them is a public health and testing advisory committee. It's actually chaired by the faculty member that I mentioned just a moment ago, Nick Jewell. He's a part of the executive recovery group that I convene every Thursday to inform all of us, the cabinet and others that I've invited to join this group about our progress in planning for the fall.
Got it. When we were talking about housing just a minute ago, you mentioned we're going to be doing some of the opposite of what we usually do. Instead of bringing students together, keeping them apart. And that brings to mind, something that you talk a lot about as a priority, and that's building that sense of community. And the extent to which community is an inherent part of the collegiate experience. How are you thinking about that now, and how will we be attempting to sort of supplant or provide some sense of community given all the obstacles and challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, that's a question that's right in the center of our attention right now. Obviously, we have to build community in different ways than we've become accustomed to do it. We are going to create, as I said before, cohorts for students. We're going to be creating online virtual communities for our students so that even before students who are coming to campus arrive on campus, they will have made connections with others. We will try to create outdoor, socially distanced events of relatively small groups of people. For example, the voluntary workouts that some of our athletes who have returned to campus are engaging in right now are 12 students apiece. We think community is so critical to the college experience, but clearly we have to build community without putting people's health at risk.
And I don't know why, but when I think about community, I also think about equity. We have an incredibly diverse student population, geographically and ethnically and socioeconomically. What role is equity and diversity and the disparities among our student population? How are we taking that into account to ensure that there is an equity of experience?
That's one of, as I said before, one of our principles is to apply an equity lens to all of our decisions. So, for example, this summer, we are looking at students' IT needs and connectivity needs. And for students that choose not to come to campus, we will provide them, if they are within certain categories of financial need, a laptop or a tablet. We're providing hotspots. We're also in assigning housing. We're prioritizing those students whose best option is, say, for example, foster youth, whose best option may be campus housing, or students with disabilities, or students whose home situations may not be conducive to study and learning.
So Let me ask you a hard question. It's how confident you're feeling about all this. There was a recent op-ed in the New York Times about reopening universities. It said that any plan that relies on students between the ages of 18 into their mid-20s to sort of to manage risk effectively is delusional. And that all of the universities who are going to have any in-person presence on their campuses were really heading down the wrong path. What's your response to that?
We are spending a lot of attention on what we're going to do with a social norming campaign. We're going to ask actually everybody on campus, not just students, to take something we're calling the Berkeley Pledge, in which we're really stressing how it's everybody's responsibility to protect not just your own health, but the health of your community. I hope that social norming is going to be powerful. If you walk around Berkeley, some of you I see, I recognize lots of faces in the Hollywood squares. Mask wearing is pretty common. And I'm just hoping that that people observe those norms, because they'll understand how much it can hurt others and also hurt the university. For example, if we have to go back to a total lockdown as we were in March and April and May.
So then that brings up my next question. What would lead us to go back? In fact, we have a question here. It says, given the USC announcement yesterday that they are now reversing course and will be almost entirely remote in the fall, do you anticipate Cal needing to do the same? So what would cause us to reverse course? Are you reconsidering right now because of the epidemiological data that we're getting from across California about a resurgence?
What would cause us to reverse course would be the level of infection in the community. If, for example, the capacity of Foothill became overwhelmed. But you have to realize that this is a very different situation from the situation in March. In March, when we went remote, we had almost no cases. So we could send students home not feeling like we were sending infection into their community. If we experienced a real surge in infections in the Berkeley community, I'm not at all sure that would be the best thing to do in terms of public health. But what we would look at is hospital capacity, the capacity of Foothill to handle the number of students who are either infected or exposed to infection. We've already become more conservative in the way in which we're handling the in-person courses. Is that departments, schools, colleges that wanted to teach particular in-person courses had to apply to the provost's office. We're already being more conservative in the number of permissions we're granting for courses to be in person.
Got it. I'm going to turn to a different part of the campus, and that's our storied research enterprise. Where do things stand with all of the research work that's going on at campus? Is that restarting as well, and how's that being managed?
Yes, it certainly is restarting. We started opening up our buildings to research in the middle of June. Now we have, I can't remember, it's 20 or 30 buildings that are currently open, main laboratory buildings. Every laboratory, in order to reopen, had to submit a plan for social distancing. We're operating at about 25% occupancy of the buildings that are open. Laboratories are using shifts. Anybody who can do their work remotely is asked to do their work remotely. Indeed, that applies to all staff. Anyone who can work remotely should be working remotely toward the end of the calendar year. But of course, there's a lot of research that can only be done with particular equipment in a physical setting. It simply can't be done remotely. And that research is all starting back up at this point.
So speaking about research, can you give us sort of maybe a broad sense of how or if Berkeley researchers are addressing or responding to the COVID crisis in terms of the work they're doing or maybe the research they've already done?
That's such, the answer to this is such an inspiring story. We have so many of our scientists who've really shifted the focus of their laboratories to COVID-19 therapeutics, to understanding this, this virus about which so little is known. And then Jennifer Doudna, who many of you probably know as the discoverer of the CRISPR-Cas9 biological mechanism and therapeutic intervention, has devoted her labs, changed her whole lab to a robotic testing facility. And we're working up to the capacity to be able to do 3,000 tests a day. She's just moved from the nasal pharyngeal swab for testing to a saliva test. We have the first of what is probably going to be about 10 kiosks set up around campus where you can go, you can make an appointment now and spit into a tube and get tested. So our faculty has just been inspiring. We had one engineer, for example, that was working on changing sleep apnea machines into ventilators. So there were, as a group of graduate students in molecular and cell biology, that was mixing up huge vats of hand sanitizer and delivering it to jails and places where there is concentration of homeless populations. So people have just been inspiring in the way in which they've turned the capabilities of their laboratories, their individual capabilities, to helping in whichever way they can envision with this terrible virus.
So a question about another aspect of campus life. As a Lair camper, I know that sports are a big deal for a lot of folks who spend their time up around Pinecrest, both participatory sports and intercollegiate sports. And I'm sure there's a lot of interest about what you think it's going to look like in the fall. Is there going to be a football season? Are other sports going to be in competition? What's your current read and projection about that?
We haven't made decisions at this point about the fall. I think it's fair to say that if we have football, there probably won't be stands in the fans, that you probably be watching it on television. But we are doing lots of scenario planning. A season that doesn't have out-of-conference play, in other words, just a Pac-12 season divided between the fall and the spring. Of course, everybody wants sports, but we're not going to make a decision that jeopardizes the health of our student athletes or our community.
All right, and I'm going to go back to some of the questions that are coming in. And this one is, how will homecoming and class reunions be handled this year? Any sense of that?
Yes, they will be virtual. And there's a team that, in our events office that is putting them together. They're actually excited about what they're doing, and so they will be virtual.
Got it. And here's one from a parent. It says, many of us out here have kids who are in high school and wanting to attend a UC school. What advice can you give on a more personal level to these kids in terms of A, staying motivated in high school when everything's gone online for the moment, and whether they should still take the ACT or SAT, given that we're moving away from it? So two very different questions, but I think two questions at the forefront of a lot of parents' minds who have kids in high school right now.
Well, I think the decision about the SAT and ACT depends on where else they're going to apply. So though the UC has gone test optional, that's not true of every school in the country. So if it will not bear upon your application to a UC, whether you've taken it or not taken it. So that's really an individual choice. In terms of staying motivated, it's such a strange time. I think it's a hard time for everybody. There are all kinds of stresses that people feel, from worry about the virus to lacking the kind of social life that we all love. But it's not a bad capacity to develop to work remotely, and I think it's an important, I've been thinking a lot about Thoreau's Walden recently, where you remember Thoreau went to spend a year alone at Walden Pond, and he says, "I went to the woods to live deliberately." And I think in this crisis, even though it's hard to live deliberately, that's what we should do. And it will end. We have one group that's thinking about the day after, and it will end, even though it feels like it will never end and every day is Groundhog Day. It will end. And it's important to put yourself in the best situation for that day.
I feel like writing down "it will end" and sticking that up on my wall sometimes everywhere so I can see it and remind myself. Another question from the audience. Have there been any discussions about the spring 2021 semester and whether all students might be able to return to campus? And is there a timeline for that decision if it hasn't been made yet?
One of the things that I've learned in this crisis is to not make decisions too soon. I think none of us knows what the spring is going to be like. None of us knows. I mean, it feels like every day when I read the newspaper, new things are being discovered about the virus, and there are new developments. So I think making a decision now would be a kind of false security. And we will wait till, really into the fall. I mean, we're lucky, we're unlucky in that we're a semester campus in the fall, in that we have to be back sooner than all quarter schools do. But in January, we're lucky that we're a semester campus because we don't really begin until the 20s in January. So we have a lot of time to see what happens, to see, how effectively the United States or the state of California will be in controlling the spread of the virus.
And before we go on, I just want to note for everybody who's watching today, I have a feeling that many of the Chancellor's answers and this discussion are only going to raise additional questions. And we have a website set up that you can access through news.berkeley.edu. We have an entire page devoted to our response to the coronavirus. It's constantly updated and it gets right down into the weeds about every detail. But let's go on. Carol, I'm getting questions here about the budget and the financial impact on the campus of the COVID crisis. Can you talk to us a little bit about what our budgetary situation looks like and what's driving that situation?
Yeah, our budgetary situation is very challenging, as is the budgetary situation of every college and university in the United States. I divide the budget situation into two buckets. First is what's happened to what we call our auxiliaries. Those are units like housing and dining, or Cal performances, or athletics, that are very dependent for their operations on revenues that they take in for the services they deliver. And those units, as I'm sure you understand, have been hit extraordinarily hard. Very big losses in housing and dining because we refunded so many housing contracts of students who went home in the spring. Housing and dining, the dorms are closed this summer, and we usually run a very robust business of summer camps and summer programs, summer session in person. There is no in-residence at all this summer. So housing and dining is very hard hit. Cal Performances is very hard hit. They canceled their season at the beginning of March. They've now canceled their fall season. Athletics has been very hard hit because it hasn't gotten the revenues that it would get from the NCAA for the March Madness. And of course, if there's no football in the fall, that would be a huge financial blow to athletics. So the auxiliaries are they've been very, very severely affected. What I'm hoping is this is it's obviously a very deep drop financially, but I'm hoping that it's going to be quickly reversible when things go back to a more normal mode of operation. The issues in our core budget are somewhat different. There, we're facing a cut from the state of 10% in our allocation. That's very serious for us. That's the Berkeley share of that is about $40 million, $42 million to be precise. We don't know yet what kind of enrollment drops we're going to have in the fall. And that, of course, has an immediate impact on income. And there are also lots of effects of COVID-19 cause expense. The testing, for example, all the building alterations that we're doing in order to make them safe. All the investment that we've made in trying to create even better remote instruction in the fall. And so all those things together, when you take them together with the fact that the regents were expecting to approve a tuition increase, they decided not to do that, so that we have multiple financial challenges also in our core budget, which will necessitate budget reductions.
So related to that, somebody just asked, given the financial challenges, what are the status of important campus projects? You've put student housing at the top of your list and seismic work that needed to be done. Are all those things on hold right now?
We certainly are putting most of our capital projects on hold. I hope that's temporary. And there are some of our projects that are they're philanthropically funded, and we'll continue with those. But it's our hope that we will get back to our capital program when things improve. But right now we're minimizing expenditure on capital projects because of our financial emergency.
Yeah, speaking of money, if timing is everything, the campus announced a major fundraising campaign with an extraordinary target. I forget exactly what it was, but I know you'll remind us.
$6 billion.
$6 billion, that's a lot of money. What is the status of that, and what is your message to alumni, given the audience that we have with us today?
One of the things that's inspired me since the pandemic has struck is how generous people have continued to be. We have raised almost $20 million for COVID-related research. We've raised a great deal of money for emergency financial aid for our students, and people have continued to give. Even in the pandemic, I think feeling the urgency of it. So we will have a wonderful philanthropic results this year. And we continue to have conversations with donors, and I think donors who have not been affected financially to a great extent by the pandemic, I think feel the urgency of giving at this point.
And is there any way for alumni who may not have the financial resources or who are looking for additional ways to support the campus? Are there other ways that alumni can sort of support or work with or collaborate with the campus or support its students in these unusual times?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I've been having a number of discussions, to give one example, with our international alumni in Asia. And of course, many of our international students will not be able to travel to the United States for fall classes, so that they will be taking their fall semester remotely. And I've been asking those alumni, would they be willing to be a virtual community for these students in Singapore or in Hong Kong or in India? And they've been very eager to do that. But I think that any alumni that are willing to be mentors, a virtual community for Cal students would be just a wonderful way of helping.
Got it. I'm going to go back to more questions that are coming in. We're going to be bouncing around through different subjects, but these are all, I think, important things that people are interested in here. Here's one. So many high schools reverted to a pass-fail in their spring semesters, and how's that impacting our admissions process?
Everybody knows that the spring semester, first of all, the class had already been admitted when the pandemic hit, so that students who are beginning school in the fall do have to submit their spring grades, but everybody knows this spring is not going to look like any other semester. And so our admissions officers know how to read those. I think a more complicated issue is going to be for admissions in the fall, when, again, the spring semester of those rising seniors, the second semester of their junior year is going to look very different from other semesters. But there is not a school in the country. I had many expressions of worry that came into my inbox from students who were just terribly worried about graduate school, and all my classes are pass not pass, and how am I going to be competitive for it? And I said, this semester is going to be different for every single student than any other semester, and people are going to know how to read that.
Got it. So I'm looking through the list of questions coming in, looking for an easy one. Can't find one. So stick with the hard ones. This one is actually not related to the COVID crisis, but relates to another piece of news. Recently, the regents adopted a resolution or a position in favor of a repeal of Proposition 209, which many see its repeal would be a reinstatement of affirmative action. And so the question here is, how will the planned readoption, and I'm not sure if that's the case, but you can answer that as well. How will the planned readoption of affirmative action impact the number of Asian students that are admitted to Berkeley?
I think I can't really answer that question. I mean, this is a long way up the road. We have to find out, first of all, what the voters do in November. And then we want to be fair to all students. I've always thought that Berkeley should be available to even more students than we currently serve. So it's my hope that we would be able, particularly with our remote capabilities, find ways of enlarging, making the pie bigger, enlarging the student body.
Got it. And here's a question that comes from a pretty dark place. What is the capacity of the university? Oh God, I can't even read this question without getting the shivers. What is the capacity of the university to take on a concurrent crisis? For instance, if there is a fire or earthquake this fall, is our emergency response ready on campus?
Oh, that's an interesting coincidence. At my recovery committee meeting this morning, we were talking about exactly that and doing crisis planning for the fall. I think it's very easy to imagine that there will be fires in the fall, given how dry the rainy season or how little rain we had. It's easy to imagine power outages. We unfortunately have experience with dealing with both those crises, but we're indeed going to be spending some time in the remainder of the summer doing exactly that, trying to figure out how we would respond to multiple crises at the same time.
That brings up, it reminds me of something you've written in the past about what you see as Berkeley's tradition of resilience. How is that all sort of being made manifest at the moment? And to what extent have those recent crises or natural disasters maybe helped us get a leg up in terms of responding to COVID?
Well, that's a wonderful question. When we had first the fires, then the power outages, the provost and the chair of the academic senate convened a group together to develop a set of recommendations for what they called instructional resilience. And we felt as a consequence of that, we were really far ahead of the game when the pandemic hit. I do think that it's deep in Berkeley's character to be resilient. And it's certainly a capacity that I value and talk a lot about. And I think it's just extraordinarily important for our community in multiple ways, not just instructional resilience. We're certainly getting practice.
Yeah. I'm going back to housing now. Somebody asked, what about housing in the Greek houses with fraternities and sororities? Do we have influence over that? Are they going to be open? What's the status?
Well, they, as a matter of fact, are open. There are students that are living there now. I pass them when I, drive across the top of campus. We don't have any control over them other than moral influence, however you assess that.
And so what is that guidance? We've had a few questions here. You talked about the Berkeley Pledge. And so can you run through one more time, because I think some people joined us late too, about what are our expectations what are we going to be asking people to do in terms of masks and distancing and hands and all the rest of it? If you could summarize that.
Yeah, frequent hand washing, always wearing a mask, whether outside or inside in a room where there is somebody else that's not your family group, and always observing social distancing.
Got it. Going back to instruction, given the different mode of instruction or the different mix that we're going to be having in the fall, is there any change in the requirements and expectations for student course loads?
No, there isn't.
Got it. And then in terms of capacity, so we're going to have a lot of students moving. We're going to have some you said some about approximately 6,000 students moving into residential halls. Then do we also expect an equal number or an even larger number to move into, privately owned residences, apartments, and the like across the city of Berkeley? So there'll be an even larger student body on campus than just those that we house?
Well, we're trying to limit the campus population to 20,000. But of course, we don't control the individual decisions of students and their families to the extent that their families are involved in those decisions. But just because somebody is living in the city of Berkeley, a student, say a graduate student, for example, doesn't mean that they're necessarily on campus a lot. What we can control is the population and activities in buildings, and we're controlling that really carefully. In terms of the activities, I already talked about the kinds of limitations on research density to 25%, limitations of classes to 25 or under, all socially distanced. So we will be controlling pretty carefully the populations inside buildings. We're much less capable of controlling the population outside on campus. This is really seen as a kind of public park. If you go out, you'll see kids biking, kids skateboarding. So that's just harder to control. And we, of course, we're trying to put the information, give the information to students and their families to make good decisions about what they want. Some students are going to choose, I'm sure, to come back to campus, even if they're not taking any classes in person, just because they want to be in Berkeley. But we're going to do a survey in mid-July, and we should have clearer information after we do this survey.
What do you mean by survey? Asking students where they plan?
Asking students what their plans are.
Got it. And somebody else, just to follow up on this question, is it safe to assume then that we also really don't have an ability to close off the campus to non-affiliates, non-students, non-staff, and to sort of check who's coming onto our property?
That's exactly right. And this is such an open campus. All of you know, it's just not possible to close the campus off. What we can do is close our buildings off, and we will have a no visitor policy in our buildings.
Here's a question from an alum that sounds like he or she may be interested in helping out. And they're asking, is there any sort of mentoring program set up for Cal students where the mentors are alumni?
That's a great question, and I think, I don't know whether there are any formal mentoring programs that are developed. The CAA would be a great organization to put one together, so it's a great idea.
So it sounds like your advice to somebody who might be interested in starting and participating in that program to reach out to the CAA with that proposal.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I've got it. And here's another one. This person says, well, I recognize that Cal has so much to do for its own planning. Are there any resources that the campus is offering to help local school districts with their delivery of online instruction?
That's really, really an interesting question. I don't, not to my knowledge, but that it may be that I just don't know. I assume that the Graduate School of Education, which is very involved in with our local school districts, may be working with local school districts. I just don't know the answer.
Got it. So stepping back, we've been really talking about some important details, but throughout this process, what have you found most challenging? What have been the hardest decisions to make for you and for your leadership team?
I think the hardest decisions, I'm going to give you a somewhat generic answer. One of the things I've observed in my leadership team, also observed in myself, is how hard it is to make decisions when so much is uncertain. And so I think that there's a kind of, you'd say almost reluctance to come to a decision sometimes, even when the decision is pretty obvious what you should do. So I think that's the most challenging thing. And then, of course, the decision is the most challenging when, it could be an issue of life and death. It's the safeness of people's lives that we're ultimately making decisions about and deciding how the campus is going to operate in the fall.
Got it. And so heading back to questions that have come in, and this is something that I think you've been getting a lot of a similar question. Do you anticipate many students deciding to take a gap year this fall? And let's actually expand it, not just a gap in terms of high school students deciding to wait a year before going to college, but what are you sensing or hearing about Berkeley students who may want to take a year off? Just if you could talk about that a little bit.
We don't have information about that yet. I was really interested that we did not have any drop in enrollment in the spring semester. Of course, we were midway through it when we met remote, but the quarter schools in the UC system, where you might see a kind of, good experiment in this, said that their spring enrollments were at the same level that they always were. Our summer enrollments in summer school are really way up this summer. More students, more Cal students are taking summer courses by a substantially increased percentage than usually do. Every institution in the country is really worrying about what is called summer melt. Students who make a decision, in the summer, either not to enroll for the first time or not to come back to take a kind of gap year. We don't know what that's going to be like yet, but we didn't have more students requesting deferrals of newly admitted students, both freshmen and transfer, than we usually do.
We only have time for a couple of more, and one's going to take us back to the housing. Somebody asking, what about co-ops, student co-ops? Is that just like living in private housing, or is that under university authority as well?
That's like fraternities and sororities. We have no authority over them.
Okay, next is there a research effort on campus towards a vaccine?
A vaccine that's more in the medical schools than it is on campus. So the things that people are researching on campus have much more to do with the fundamental biology of the disease, with testing and with therapeutics.
And finally, one more question that I'm going to ask you for some closing thoughts, but one more. Somebody asking, what is the availability of testing for both COVID and for antibody for staff and affiliates, and where would people go, and is it free? It sounds like somebody who may work on campus or may have
absolutely. You just sign up. I think it's on the IGI website, Innovative Genomics Institute website. You have an appointment and then you go and you go to a kiosk and you spit in a tube, and that's the testing, and yes, it's free.
And again, I'll reiterate for whoever asked that question and other people who are interested about the details of around testing and distancing requirements and research efforts. If you go to news.berkeley.edu, you'll find a dedicated page with all the details about the campus response to the COVID crisis. So Carol, we're just about out of time. I just maybe share a few closing thoughts about your hopes and your projections and what it looks like on the road ahead for not just the remainder of the summer, but for the years to come.
I was listening to the news last night. I was listening to David Brooks, and the New York Times columnist, and he often writes about a crisis of isolation in this country. And one of the observations he was making that really struck home to me is he said he's seeing so many examples in this strange time of isolation of people coming together in community in new ways. And I one of the last pieces of writing I did as a literary critic was about dystopian novels. I was really fascinated by the fact that that many writers who didn't write science fiction particularly were writing these dystopian novels about the end of civilization as we know it due to a pandemic or due to climate change. And these novels are very dystopian. Everything, civilization degrades, things, go back to a very primitive Lord of the Flies kind of situation. And what's been striking to me in this real pandemic is that's not what's happening. In fact, we have, even though, someday I think a historian will talk, or maybe people are talking now, about the relationship between the most powerful call for social justice and equity that we've seen since the 60s, since the civil rights movement, in relationship to this pandemic. What I see on campus is extraordinary public spiritedness of people just going above and beyond at this time of isolation to help their communities and an institution that's very dear to them. So even though this is a tremendously difficult time, and there's something I've quoted often: we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. It's an extraordinarily difficult time for so many people. I've been inspired by the kind of public spiritedness and generosity of so many.
Chancellor Christ, I want to thank you for those powerful words on behalf of all of my fellow Lair campers, and on behalf of everybody who cares deeply about UC Berkeley, to thank you for your time and your willingness to answer a whole slew of really tough questions. And also on behalf of everybody else, just to wish you and your team the best of luck.
Thank you. And I see Oski.
Everybody,
thank you. Great to see you all.
And go Bears.
Go Bears.